morning, everybody, and welcome to XY Sense's webinar, Occupancy Metrics to help you manage a hybrid workplace. My name is Libby and I will be your host for today. We're also lucky enough to be joined by Aditya Vishwanathan, who leads analytics and data science at XY Sense.
Hi everyone, excited to get started for today.
Hi Ad. So Ad has a PhD in statistics with specialization in aerospace engineering optimization. But on a day-to-day basis, Ad is passionate about working with workplace teams to help them solve their spatial and occupancy challenges through data analysis. Welcome, Ad.
Thanks, Libby.
It's worth noting that today's webinar is going to be all about going into a deep dive in data and analytics for your workplace. We're going to be looking at how specific data metrics can be applied to help you navigate the complexity of space and occupancy planning in our newly hybrid workplaces. This is a really hot topic, isn't it, Ad?
It very much is, Libby. This is a big deal for our clients at the moment who are always looking for different ways to slice and analyze the data, not only to make the experience of returning to the office better, but also to respond to queries about how return to office is progressing and what their property strategy should look like in a post-pandemic world. Because our clients are so interested in this at the moment, I thought this would be a great topic for the subject of today's webinar.
Awesome. Well, we've gotten a really good turnout today. So thank you everybody for registering and coming along. We'll also be sending the recording of today's session to everybody out there today if you want to press pause and dig into some of the stuff that we're looking at. Now, it's worth noting that we are going to have a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of today's presentation. So if you do have a question as we're moving through today, just pop it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen and we'll get to those questions at the end. So with, I guess, the opening done, let's get into this data analysis, Ad. Over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Libby. So let's get started. The first thing to note here is that the jury is definitely in, and hybrid working styles appear to be here to stay. A majority of corporate workers around the globe have spent the better part of 12 months working from home. And survey after survey indicates that there wasn't a massive dip in productivity after all. And in fact, many cases, the opposite was true and productivity had actually increased. Workers overwhelmingly are reporting that they have a preference to not work from the office 5 days a week. And as a result, in a war for talent, with potential upsides of saving corporate real estate costs, a large majorities of CEOs that some form of hybrid and remote collaboration is here to stay. In recent weeks, major employers around the world have confirmed that they're making hybrid working styles permanent. Policies will obviously vary from company to company, such as the ones that you see on the slide here. But it's clear that employees will not have to attend offices 5 days a week as a norm anymore. They can work from home if they wish. Many are also announcing that they plan to shed a whopping 20 to 40% of their real estate space. And a recent survey from KPMG confirmed that approximately 69% of global CEOs are embracing that dreaded D word, downsizing, and they're intending to downsize, obviously for cost reduction. But as we workplace professionals know, hybrid workplaces are much more complicated than traditional workplaces. You've got teams, people rotating in and out, depending on what project or special deadline they're working on. A common trend we're also seeing is that many, if not all, spaces are going to become bookable. Obviously, this may suit some work styles more than others because it does require massive behavior change on behalf of employees to remember to check in and check out from everything that they're using. But the idea of booking is obviously twofold. Firstly, you can contact trace if need be. And secondly, you still need to cater for people who will be in the office 5 days a week. So that's clearly something that we need to integrate when we book. It's also important to create equity between those working from home and who are working in the office. And something that's really important is obviously meeting spaces have to be fit out with new tech as a result. So over the next 18 months, PwC, for example, is planning to spend $75 million to redesign their offices with new tech, such as VR. So yes, in a few years, you might log into your next Zoom meeting and see 5 pairs of oversized VR goggles looking back at you. Then there's the essential question of what will the modern day office space look like? Do they need to change, right? Do they need more project spaces with, for example, whiteboards, or for more social zones for reconnection or team learning? We may also anecdotally think that we need fewer desks. So there are lots of questions and lots of things up in the air there. So delivering the right amount of space for your team, we may, and obviously delivering the right amount of space for your team and real estate budget was already a tricky proposition pre-COVID. And now with hybrid workplaces, things just got a whole lot more complicated. So how do we strike that balance that we're all seeking? On the one hand, you've got to deliver an awesome hybrid workplace experience. And on the other, you've got to navigate the strategic cost pressures of retaining space that isn't being used by as many people. And this should probably come as no surprise to all of you, given that I'm a data scientist working for an AI tech company, but accurate, verifiable data is the key to all of this. Because the connected workplaces, we all need to support hybrid teams, and our business's bottom lines, these all run on data. An observational study that you might have conducted once or twice a year just won't cut it in the modern workplace, given that everything is in flux per day, per minute, and when you're measuring things over time, things are always changing. In the longer term, we envisage that space management in workplaces is going to be an iterative process where teams continually measure and people have to update their strategy from time to time. In this new world, offices will be far more agile than fixed. And the way you capture, measure, and apply data is going to be the most critical thing. So what are the occupancy metrics that will help you manage this modern hybrid workplace? So I'm going to take you through 5 groups of metrics today that I recommend workplace teams to start to measure and to benchmark. So we'll start with number 1, and it's the one metric which you're probably all already measuring or have some kind of idea of, or potentially looking at measuring very soon, and that is location attendance or people counting. And put simply, that's just the number of people that are in a floor or building on a given day or at a given time. Now, this data is the bare minimum that modern workplaces need to keep a track of. And it's kind of like a barometer for how hybrid your workplace is, right? How many people are working at home versus how many people are coming into work at the office. It's also crucial to keep track of capacity constraints, because as we've all seen post-COVID-19, things like meeting rooms, lift areas, everything has room limits, and we need to keep track of them over time. Now, this source of data can come from, or there are various sources. First of all, Speedgate, which I'm sure, Speedgate data, which I'm sure some of you might already be using today. That's a great estimate, so it allows you to track people coming in and people going out. Now, the issue is that obviously you're going to run into problems with people tailgating. So that is not signing in their card, for example, as they come in. The other problem with Speedgates is that people might come in via a Speedgate, but they might exit via a stairwell or an emergency exit or something. And in those scenarios, your numbers are going to be a little bit off as a result. The other solution is security walkarounds, which I'm sure a lot of you will have security teams either at your disposal or working with you. Now, obviously, these are resource constrained. We can't have security staff walking around all day, every day, looking at every single space and making sure that head counts are where they're supposed to be. And that leads us to the final source, which is sensor data. And given that they are real time, can track any and all areas of a building, and are accurate, they are the most robust solution. So head counts are very useful for the numerous reasons that I just listed, but they're not enough in the modern hybrid workplace. And there are a few reasons why. First of all, they can't tell you where and how long employees are spending their time. They can't tell you which teams are making use of their space, and they can't tell you whether office spaces are built for purpose. So clearly, to get into all of those questions, we need to go deeper. And that leads me to the next group of metrics, which are incredibly important for a hybrid workplace because it comprises of a significant real estate cost within any portfolio, and that is work points or desks and their utilization. One argument we could make in the new kind of modern hybrid workplace is that there isn't as much of a need for desks, because after all, would you really come into the office just to check your emails? You'd probably think not. Well, it turns out that people aren't just coming into the office to attend meetings. We can see here that the data that we're capturing shows us that utilization is trending upwards pretty rapidly, as well as average usage per day. Now, yes, it hasn't quite reached pre-pandemic levels as yet. So you can see here, January 2020, February 2020, everything fell off a cliff. So we're not quite back to those levels, but it is clear that even though people need to collaborate, people are still coming into the office and require a private, quiet space to work, and Workpoints fit the bill for this. So the next point is, as offices are adapting to COVID-safe measures, we are seeing an increasing trend in booking software integration. So that is the ability to book the desk you are planning to work at before you come into work. Now, with a real-time sensor, you can obviously correlate usage to when a desk is booked. So we can automatically check in that a desk is in use, or conversely, we can also check out once the desk has been inactive for a certain amount of time. Now, the important thing to stress here is that we can correlate booked data versus actual utilization. So you'll avoid the situation where someone books a desk overnight and then nobody turns up the next day. And that desk is, it remains busy throughout the entire day, so nobody else can actually use it because it's already been booked. A really good anecdote that I heard recently at a workplace conference was that there was a 3,000 person building for a large corporate in Amsterdam, where the building was full, but only 13 people had checked in. So obviously the result to take away from this is that humans are somewhat the limiting factor, and behavior change is really needed to make these desk booking software integrations work. But with a real-time sensor, we can somewhat circumvent some of those teething issues. All right, so the next set of metrics to understand in a hybrid workplace are for neighborhoods and teams. So that is how many desks are being utilized by certain neighborhoods or teams, and potentially how many desks can we reallocate away such that we can optimize that. So we've seen firsthand the headaches that facility and space managers can face when they're asked by team leaders for more space. With a real-time sensor and relying on trustworthy data, you can put the emotions to one side and rely on trustworthy, thorough data to inform your arrangements for a hybrid workplace. So neighborhood balancing, as the name suggests, involves optimizing the allocations of desks to specific neighborhoods or teams. And that's through identifying pockets of, perhaps overcrowded space in certain areas versus undercrowded space in other areas. So at a high level, it involves 4 steps. Firstly, we need to track the average utilization, or basically the utilization of certain groups of desks. And that's, once again, either a team or a neighborhood. And we're not just tracking averages here. So that's what you can see in this table, but it's also really important to track the peaks in desk usage for those neighborhoods. So were they ever at peak capacity? So for example, if I allocate 16 desks to IT, right? Were they ever actually using those 16 desks on any given day? And if so, how many given days in, let's say, a 6-month or a yearly period? Once we complete that, we're also looking at analyzing the growth rate of those neighborhoods. So it's all well and good to look at an average case, but then we also need to measure how much that is changing over time, because you wouldn't want to rush into taking away desks from a team, for example, with low utilization, if they're perhaps growing at, let's say, 10% month on month. Finally, we can put those two together come up with a kind of smart allocation. So optimize the allocation of desks per neighborhood or team. Or conversely, we can actually find out how many extra people can be fit within the exact same amount of space. So that's really useful for teams which might be rapidly growing in headcount or aggressively hiring. So the real power of the system comes when we kind of aggregate this neighborhood balancing process over a floor, multiple floors, even multiple buildings. And the net result is we can save on total floor space, therefore saving your organization a lot of time and money. So you can come up with, statistics like X number of desks. So let's say 40 number of desks across a couple of floors can be saved. And that's obviously a huge money saver. And you can even refit or repurpose those desks into other areas which your employees might be using more often, such as meeting rooms or collaboration spaces. Or conversely, this says that you have the extra capacity to fit an extra 40 people. So you can potentially push off searching for additional space if your leases work out in that specific manner. Okay, so I'm sure you've all heard by now that collaborative spaces are here to stay, and remote collaboration as well is here to stay. Now, in the new age of the hybrid workplace, it's extremely important that employers suit each individual employee's different working styles. So that means, providing adequate open and closed collaboration spaces, which are fit for meetings and collaboration. So it should come as no surprise to see that collaboration space utilization is trending upwards, as you can see here. And on average, we can see that collaboration spaces as a whole are used about an hour more than Workpoints. And these trends are changing over time. So it will be very useful to keep track of these as the year goes on and people execute their kind of return to work strategies. But what's even more interesting here is actually breaking that down by different space types, right? So not just meeting rooms, but breakout areas, project spaces. There are lots of other areas, kitchen areas, for example. And the main thing to take away from this is that your average hybrid worker is spending the majority of their time in these collaboration spaces, not at their desk. So it's also, I guess, really important to note here, as you're collecting this data, that humans are fluid creatures, right? We don't necessarily choose to meet in designated conference rooms or meeting rooms. We might meet in, a kind of couch area, a casual seating area. We might choose to meet on a set of bean bags that have been, laid around in a kind of casual project space area. So the key thing here is that if you're relying on just booking data of, let's say, meeting rooms, that really isn't going to cut it because people tend to meet and collaborate where they see fit. Which metrics should we be tracking for collaborative spaces? Like I mentioned in the previous slide, obviously we need to be tracking utilization across all collaborative spaces. Then we need to also track length of stay. So how long are people on average using every space, and the number of occupants that are using that space as well. We have seen since COVID-19, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier as well, that capacity limits have been put in place across various meeting rooms, lift areas, any type of open collaborative space. So as a result, it is very important to keep track of what these breaches look like over time and measuring them versus utilization. And this is really important because government regulations are changing every day. There are things always in flux. So it is really important to manage this as regulations and governance changes are moving ahead. Then finally, we have capacity ratios. So that is how efficiently are rooms being used. This is extremely important. So a capacity ratio is basically just the ratio of occupants to that room size. So if I have a meeting room that can seat 20 people, and there are only on average 5 people using it, that results in an average meeting capacity of 40%. And that represents an inefficient usage of that room. So it's extremely important that we optimize for things like capacity ratios and utilization, which leads me on to right sizing. So this is obviously a hot topic. We need to make sure that our collaborative spaces are fit for purpose, right? If there is a high demand in your workplace for, small kind of meeting spaces, then we need to have adequate spaces for them. Conversely, if there's not that many people, large groups meeting, then there's probably not that much of a need for 5 or 6 large boardrooms, conference rooms. And that's an example which you can see here. So obviously, to measure this supply and demand, we do need to track utilization. So, how many groups of 2 are meeting in specific areas? How many groups of 3 areas? And we can also corroborate that with booking data, right? To see how much demand, raw demand there is for a particular type of space. Another important metric to track is what is the total occupancy of the collective of your collaborative spaces, right? So here we can see that we can fit 189 people into all meeting rooms, but there was only 105 people ever using them at one time, right? So that displays a clear excess in meeting room size. And how many times have you heard in your workplace employees coming around and saying that they can't find a meeting room, but then upon conducting a walk around, you see that actually there is lots of space available in meeting rooms. So to avoid situations like those, that's where right sizing can be really, really effective in informing you not just about meeting rooms, so not just telling you, okay, you can split up your large meeting room into 2, but also recommending other types of space. So do you need more phone booths in your office space? Do you need more project spaces? Do you need more kitchen booths, etc.? Okay, so the last group of metrics, which I'm going to go through today, are the ones for portfolio analysis. So this is where we take kind of like a 10,000-foot view of our real estate portfolio and look at, big picture trends. And these are more critical than ever at a time when companies have a lot of vacant office space and need to plan for, sometimes 5 or even 10 years into the future for the purpose of lease management. Here's what we're seeing at the moment from a more macro perspective. And just to make this webinar kind of contextually relevant, I'll be focusing on Australia and New Zealand for the purpose of this demonstration. So firstly, we can see that buildings are, quite low in utilization, approximately 20 to 30% lower than pre-pandemic levels. And that's, everyone obviously would be aware of this. It's been drummed into us over the last, 6 months to a year. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that areas around the world are beginning to diverge as businesses execute their specific RTO strategies and governance or government regulation changes. So, for example, we can see here that New Zealand is starting to accelerate in terms of office utilization over Australia. And for the first time, I think since COVID, Melbourne has finally overtaken Sydney in office utilization. Now, this is rather strange timing, given that I think the health minister is probably going to hop on a conference call in the next, or rather a press conference in the next few hours and say that there's new lockdowns in Melbourne. At least that's what we're all believing. So, this stat might change, but I guess the moral of this story is that the situation is ever changing. And now more than ever, it's extremely important to measure your space before acting, such that you can make informed decisions for the future. So what metrics should we be tracking? Really, it's more of the same when it comes to portfolio utilization. So firstly, we should be comparing the utilization of individual floors and buildings for that matter. So firstly, for floors, something which, an anecdote from recently is that we were working with a client, one of the corporates who owns a building in a CBD location, and they have multiple floors in that building. And they were considering whether it was viable for them to sublease a specific number of their floors because of the extremely low vacancies. Oh, sorry, extremely high vacancies, extremely low occupancy. And we were able to use real-time data for that to provide a much more thorough and data-driven approach to that question, as opposed to providing kind of crude guesstimates and predictions out into the future. Then we can also look at utilization of buildings. And this is really useful to compare, which areas of the world are underperforming and which areas of the world are overperforming, as especially, this is particularly relevant if you have a global portfolio of real estate that you're managing. Finally, or rather, next up, we have the utilization of Workpoints versus collaborative spaces. Once again, one of the most important barometers of, how hybrid your workplace is, how agile your workplace is, whether your people are coming in to just, take meetings, or are they coming in to sit at their desk more and conduct more private personal work. Everyone knows the bottom line is important, so that's obviously something we should be tracking here. The cost of unutilized space can be measured in terms of per square meter, sometimes per work point is also relevant, and we need to be seeing that over time such that we're heading in the right direction. Okay, and last but not least, we have utilization growth rates. And these are, particularly when talking about big picture, it's not just what is the situation currently. It's what do we predict the situation is going to be months or weeks, months, or even a year out from now, right? So tracking rates of change of utilization on a building, on a floor level, or even on a portfolio level, and then measuring that versus specific targets that you might have is extremely important. And something that's really useful with this is that we can measure utilization growth rates on, let's say, a floor or building level, and we can match that with the neighborhood or team growth rates that I was mentioning a little bit earlier in this webinar. So that gives you a really good perspective of both macro and micro utilization. So now that I've taken you through the metrics that matter most to managing space in a hybrid workplace, it's worth checking in on the maturity of your data strategy. So how do you currently measure occupancy and utilization in your workplace? How difficult is it to access and combine and interpret that data? And finally, do your systems support real-time occupancy data capture? So when it comes to measuring occupancy and utilization, not all tools are made equal. XY Sense is a new kind of workplace sensor that's been aligned to meet the needs of today's property teams. XY Sense is an AI sensor about the size of a smoke detector that's installed in the ceilings of your office, but that's where comparisons to other sensors ends. So XY Sense has doubled the coverage of other solutions out there, with each unit coverage of about 1,000 square feet of office space, and that's give or take about 20 desks. And this obviously means fewer sensors that you have to buy and install, without sacrificing the quality of data that you can collect. It works in real time, capturing positional coordinates down to every foot, and this happens every 2 seconds, and the process occurs within the device itself. It's worth noting again here that XY Sense is completely 100% anonymous. The sensor only records XY coordinates of people over time, as you can see in this little infographic here. And there is no way at all to identify individuals from this. But the real-time data of this capture, combined with the positional accuracy and immense coverage of each individual unit, means that we're measuring not just a device, right, an asset that's left at a desk, but we're thoroughly tracking how people are moving throughout an office. You can see, for example, team members, whether they're working, at a couch area in the corner of your office, or perhaps they're working in a group of desks that were allocated to them. This real-time data forms the foundation of our analytics. And this is really provided, these dashboards are all provided out of the box, and they're designed to help you navigate the complexities of managing space in this new hybrid environment. With that, I'd love to jump into some Q&A and answer some of the questions you might have around building these types of reports, or the trends that we've seen and that I've presented to you over this webinar. So Libby, are there any questions coming through?
Thanks, Ad. That was a really fantastic presentation. And we do have a couple of questions, so I'm going to just run through them now. Ad, how do you consider occupancy data, so real-time occupancy data versus utilization data across time? And how do you adjust measuring those two things? Or is there a different approach that you take to occupancy data versus utilization data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So occupancy data is somebody in that space at that particular time, right? And we measure that data every 2 seconds. So when you aggregate that over, days, weeks, or even months, you can calculate exactly how many hours were spent in that space. So I guess that would be the first way of tracking utilization, just how much time is spent in that space. Another way of cutting up utilization data is how many spaces were quote unquote active or used for that day. And this is where you can configure your own business rules into the mix here. So for example, you might deem a work point active or used for that day if it's used for longer than 60 minutes in that particular day cumulatively, or perhaps 30 minutes across an hour. And that's where you can say, okay, with all the data that I've aggregated over these kind of 2-second intervals, does that all add up to 30 minutes in an hour? Or does that all add up to 60 minutes in a day? If so, that desk is utilized. And then when you kind of aggregate that over months or even a year, you can then calculate as a simple percentage, for example, how many days of the year was that desk used? And then arrive at, let's say, a 50, 60% utilization rate. So there are lots of ways you can cut up utilization data. But I guess the key thing to understand there is if you're collecting data every 2 seconds, you can pretty much slice up utilization and usage however you want.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And I guess another layer here is there actually a right percentage that people should be targeting when it does come to their utilization in their offices?
Not really. I mean, there's always kind of a sweet spot, but that sweet spot is always kind of changing with time. And so that sweet spot for some offices might be 70 to 90%. One really good example, which I like to use, is comparing neighborhoods or teams, right? So for a sales team who might be out on the road a lot or potentially, not in the office, their utilization sweet spot might only be 40 to 50%, right? But for another team that's more desk bound, let's say IT, you might want to make sure that their utilization rate is between 70 and 90%. So the sweet spot really changes, and it really comes down to optimizing your individual real estate strategy.
Got it. That makes a whole lot of sense. And I guess it can be a little bit dangerous to maybe look at past utilization benchmarks and expect that, moving into this new hybrid world, that needs to be the same. So another question here, with XYSense, do people have access to the raw sensor data itself? So can they configure their own reports as well?
Yes, they very much can. So XYSense, we actually have an API feed. So that takes the raw sensor data right from the sensor, and you can ingest that data into any kind of system that you're looking for. So essentially you can use our real-time occupancy API for that. For most of our clients, the dashboards that we provide out of the box are sufficient. They cover numerous analytics on multiple levels, right from a 10,000-foot view right down to an individual workpoint or collaborative space. There are also ways in which you can extract that data from the dashboards to make your own reports. So you can export them into a CSV spreadsheet and then use that data yourself. And if there's a visualization or some way in which you want to chop and change the data, you can also do that yourself as well. So yeah, I guess the net answer there is we collect so much data, and there's a lot of flexibility around the reports that you can customize.
So to what extent can companies actually realize the benefits of 1,000-foot coverage per unit? Do we find that we're limited by columns, furniture, walls, etc., in terms of free space efficiency?
Yeah, so the real benefit of the 1,000-foot coverage comes in open areas, right? So like we said, we can cover up to around about 20 or so desks with just one sensor. So when you compare that to asset-based tracking, where you would have to have one sensor per per laptop, or even one of those desk occupancy sensors where per desk you have to have a sensor, you can clearly see that the total cost of ownership in that case would be much less. So that's one clear benefit. You are right in saying that when you have closed off walls, and our sensors obviously rely on line of sight. So we do need line of sight for the sensors to be working. But in light of that, if you do have glass walls, for example, where there are ways of looking through that, the sensor will still work and realize that range. So it really comes down to your individual space. But clearly, yes, from an economical standpoint and from a cost perspective, the benefit is really there in kind of more open areas.
Awesome. Thanks, Ad. Another question. Traditional observation studies are also enable teams to collect information around activity of the person. So are they on the phone? Are they deep in work, maybe preparing a document? Is this type of data collection possible with XYSense? If not, are there plans to collect this type of information?
It very much is possible. So one of the things which we've been working on currently in our labs, it's not available right now, but it is in our roadmap, is observing human behavior, right? So that is things like, are people on the phone? Another really important one, which we've considered from a health and well-being perspective, is are people sitting or standing, right? So all of these features are actually really, really important because once again, this all comes down to employee experience, right? If we can make sure that employees are having a great experience in the workplace, and that means not having to duck into a 20-person meeting room to take a phone call, right? Or perhaps are they sitting or standing, or are they getting enough exercise throughout the day? So all of these things are really important, and we are very much making that a focus in our roadmap in, I guess, the months and in the very near future, I guess.
Okay, but it is worth noting that that data collection isn't available right now.
Not currently, but it is in our roadmap, yes.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. Okay, well, I think that's the last of our questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you do have a follow-up question that you'd like to ask Ad, you can respond to the email that we're going to send with the recording. Just hit reply if you've got a follow-up question and we can get back to you with further information. That's all that we do have time for today, folks. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us to discuss all things workplace analytics in a hybrid world. If you are interested in accessing more resources on return to work, comparing different utilization tools and approaches, or accessing some of our white papers and articles, just head to xysense.com/resources. You'll also find some of our other webinars there today. But with that, I'd like to say thank you, Ad, for your presentation. And
yeah, my pleasure, Libby.
And thanks to everybody who joined us this morning. Have a great day.